On today's edition of the show, we are going to be doing a series check-in with a very familiar voice with the Florida Panthers. Today's show, Doug Plagens will be joining us to discuss the Florida Panthers to the first 4 games, prepare for Game 5, and of course, discuss some of the injuries and goalie situation here on the show.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Tuesday, April 25th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez, and you can follow me on Twitter at MondoMan12. Follow the show account on Twitter at LO_FLA Panthers. You could also follow that same at on Instagram as well at LO_FLA Panthers. And thank you so much for the everydayers who come here to get your daily Florida Panthers fix. So thank you for the everydayers. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Cats fans, we have this, of course, with the Florida Panthers having 2 days off in between Game 4 and Game 5. It gives us a great opportunity to maybe dissect more of what has happened through the first 4 games and maybe take a little bit of a step back and look forward, and also think about the preparation that it will take for this Florida Panthers team, of course, to come back from a 3-1 series deficit where the Florida Panthers do find themselves in. And who better to bring in on the show someone who's there on the daily with the Florida Panthers, and he is the radio play-by-play voice of the Florida Panthers on the Florida Panthers radio network, Doug Plagens. Doug, welcome back to Locked On Panthers.
Armando, thanks for having me as always. Great to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. And here's the thing. I had to bring you on here because I remember the last time you came on the show was February 23rd. Before we signed off on the end of the show, because it was on record, I remember you spoke about, hey, I hope that the Panthers go on a run so that we could do an episode in relation to the playoffs. And then the next week we saw each other in Tampa in the press box, and I heard you say the same thing. And I said, okay, I got to keep my word to myself and go and asking you to come on. So I'm thankful that you specifically chose during the 2 off days that the Florida Panthers do have, and of course with you traveling up to Boston tomorrow. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come on.
No problem. I said it back then because I meant it. You know, if the Panthers that was back in February, and I said hopefully we're doing a playoff show together at some point in time, and here we are. And obviously a lot can happen in a playoff series. Panthers find themselves heading to Boston on the brink of elimination right now, but certainly a lot of things can happen in a playoff series, as I mentioned, and we'll get into talking about it. But this team has thrived at times with its back against the wall. We saw that in those last few weeks of the regular season when they strung together that win streak. I know the Boston Bruins in and of themselves are a tall order and a tough task, but like I said, crazier things have happened, and all it takes is one at a time. So Game 5 in Boston's the next objective here for the Panthers coming up on Wednesday.
Yeah, and I want to also give you the floor as well and talk about your thoughts through the first 4 games, because we've seen 2 different Florida Panthers teams on the road versus at home. Game 1 was that game that you felt that the Florida Panthers could challenge them, and then Game 2 coming with the win, and then being swept at home. What were your thoughts as the as the games went on for this Florida Panthers team, to where they started to where they were now with game one to now?
Well, it could be a bit of a long-winded response here, but if we're going to go game by game, if I'm looking at game one, the Panthers came out, they were all over the Bruins early in that one. And I kind of look at that one. I know Linus Ullmark had, 41, 42 saves in game four, but game one was the game that Linus Ullmark kind of had to steal for Boston. He was really good in the beginning. Panthers played a good game. I mean, you hit it on the head right there. That was the game where they saw, hey, they can hang with these guys. They didn't get the result they were looking for, but it was close, and it truly was one of those game could go one way or the other games. The other thing we saw in that game, and then it further got enforced in game two when the Panthers had kind of a runaway win, was with the Boston Bruins, when you get behind against Boston, for Boston, it almost feels like when the Bruins have a 1-goal lead, that's like a 2-goal lead for anybody else. But for the Bruins, a 1-goal lead with the depth that they have and the collective speed they have and the way they insulate their goaltender, but the way their goaltender can also come up with the big save when he needs to, when they get up by a goal, they're a very, very tough team to play against because they can start to dictate it their way. But in game two, and we saw this, when the Panthers scored first and the Panthers kept pressuring, Boston got out of its comfort zone. And that's a team that won 65 games during the regular season. In 82 regular season games, they held the opposition to 2 or fewer in 52 of those.
Wow.
Think about that.
Wow.
They gave up 2 or less in 52 out of 82 games during the regular season. So that's not a team that's used to being behind much in games. If you get them behind, it pushes them into a really unfamiliar situation, especially on home ice. They're not used to losing at home. They're not used to giving up more than 2. And in game 2, the Panthers really pulled them out of their comfort zone, and you saw it. You saw how the Panthers' forecheck was going and how many pucks the Bruins defense specifically was turning over. The Carter Verhaeghe goal in game 2 was a direct example of that. Charlie McAvoy saw Sam Bennett coming. He panicked with the puck, gave it away. Kachuk to Verhaeghe, and that was the 4-2 goal, I believe, in that one. And that was where you started to see the Bruins' body language look really uncharacteristic because the Panthers had gotten up by a couple. And at that point, the Bruins were in a situation they're just not used to, and you could tell. And then things got a little wacky later on in the game, things like that. But that tied the series at 1. And then you look at game 3 and 4 in Florida, and the Panthers played pretty well in both those games. They played a game that's good enough to win on a lot of nights. You look at the game 4 loss, they had something like 43 shots on net against the Boston Bruins. And there were stretches, even you go back to game 1, felt like the Panthers had the puck more than Boston did in that game. The Bruins just were opportunistic on a couple of occasions, and they were able to get a great performance from their goaltender to hold the Panthers to 1 goal, that being back in game 1. You look at it, Boston's won 3 out of the 4 games, but the way the Panthers played, they played well enough to at least earn a split in the home games. Cards didn't fall that way. But now they go back to Boston, where they have won in this series. And as I mentioned, you look at those games down the stretch. This is a Panthers team that got in the playoffs by 1 point. Every point they had this season mattered. So they've played well when their backs are against the wall. And Paul Maurice has preached it all season, really in the second half, especially when you really started to feel like the Panthers were playing playoff games every single night. He said it's a lot of times the biggest thing is how you get off the mat after you get pushed down, after a loss. How do you respond? And this team's had an ability to come up with big performances when they've needed one most. They're going to need one more than they have all season long in game 5, but they're certainly capable of doing it. And in this series, they have won in that building. So all you can do is take it one game at a time. Billy Lindsay's talked about it, and he said one of the biggest differences with playoff hockey in itself is that you have to really just go out there one shift at a time, not even one period at a time. You take it one shift at a time. You go out and you execute it the way that you need to, and over the course of a game, it can add up. And I think that's a trait you've seen out of the Boston Bruins too, is that you can tell there's a group, the way that they play, they know that the game isn't going to be won in 5 minutes. It's not going to be won in 10 minutes. It's very much a process. So that's playoff hockey, and that's what we're seeing. And when the Panthers won in Game 2, you saw that. You've seen the Panthers play really well over the course of the whole series. This could easily be a 2-2 series going back to Boston. It just didn't fall that way, but that's a good hockey team over there. They didn't win 65 games in the regular season by accident. So again, it's a tall order, but the Panthers have won in Boston in this series. They've beaten Boston 3 times between the regular season and the playoffs. There's nobody else that can claim that in the National Hockey League. So the Panthers, again, a tall order, but it's not impossible.
Not impossible. And Josh Mahura today after practice, a very light practice for the Florida Panthers, said that we got 3 Game 7s and that we need to focus on one at a time. And Game 5 is definitely the next one for this Florida Panthers team. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2. We're going to discuss more about the goaltending situation, some of the things that have come out as far as why certain players have been scratched, and we're going to discuss preparing for a possible opponent in the Boston Bruins. We're going to discuss that next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But first, we're going to tell you all about Indeed. When you're drafting your fantasy team, do you ever wish you could handpick the best stars for your business team? If you're building your next talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for different candidates with the right skills when you could do that all with Indeed. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. And now, with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that meet your hiring criteria. Visit Indeed.com/lockedon to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Segment number 2 here on this Tuesday, April 25th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. It is a series check-in edition of the show with the radio play-by-play voice of the Florida Panthers, Doug Plagens. And Doug, Paul Maurice spoke after practice today, very light one, that Anthony Duclair was a late scratch heading into Game 4 at FLA Live Arena. Talked about that something tweaked during Game 4, and so we were thinking, before we knew about the news of tweaking something, I also got a chance to reevaluate the situation that had happened in the first round last year against the Washington Capitals, where Anthony Duclair did find himself being scratched in Game 6, and of course scoring a goal in Game 1 against Tampa. But of course, this time it's for an injury situation, having 7 shots on goal, unfortunately a -6 in the series for the Panthers. But not only I want to get your thoughts on Anthony Duclair and him being part of this lineup if he's able to come back, but also the difficult situation that Paul Maurice found himself in with having to tweak the D pairs, with Radko Gudas going on the top pair and then Casey Fitzgerald playing on the third pair in Game 4. What were your thoughts on that, and also the adversity that the Florida Panthers had to go through with dealing with these injuries?
Well, a few things going off of that. You go across every series in the National Hockey League, and everybody deals with this time of the year. 82 games in the regular season. You get into the playoffs, the intensity gets ratcheted up, the physicality gets ratcheted up. You're going to have bumps and bruises across the board. That's going to happen. With Anthony Duclair, all I say is you hope that he can get ready and shake that off as quickly as possible. And Paul Maurice has, very much been day by day and close to the vest on everything. So I don't know anything more than you do on that stuff as far as, from what we understand. Anthony Duclair, something came up, during warmups, and he was a late scratch for Game 4. And obviously, you hope that you can get Aaron Ekblad back as quickly as possible, and he can shake off whatever he was dealing with as well. So because obviously he wasn't out there for Game 4, which, as you alluded to there, caused the Panthers to have to kind of reconfigure things as far as the combinations defensively. Now, you look at that game the other day, and Casey Fitzgerald came in, and he was because he's a right shot, Ekblad's a right shot, kind of allowed them to keep the split the way that it's been. And Paul Morey said he really liked Casey Fitzgerald's game, and I did too. That was a guy playing his first Stanley Cup playoff game, and he wouldn't have known it because he didn't look out of place one bit, and he hasn't played a ton, but he got right into the lineup. He wasn't overwhelmed by the speed. He was getting involved physically, and he's a smart guy that was just keeping things simple out there. And that's what's going to be really important in a playoff game, especially for a guy that's getting a spot start in the lineup, if you will, because of another player going out. So I thought he filled in great. Obviously, when you don't have a guy like Aaron Ekblad in there, it's going to change a lot as far as how the minutes are distributed and things like that, because he's a guy that's going to play a lot. But those are things you have to just be ready to handle on the fly. Sometimes you look at Game 3, I don't think we knew that David Krejci was going to get scratched by Boston until about 4 minutes before faceoff. So you just teams this time of the year, that's why you want to make sure you have guys that you can call upon if you need to. And the Boston Bruins have had to use some of their depth as well as we've gotten into this playoff series. And same kind of thing that happened with Duclair as in Game 4, having to be ready to make a change like that really on the fly. You're talking minutes before faceoff, during warmups, something like that. So these teams are all equipped to handle it. And I think you look at Game 4, and there were some different looks that the Panthers put forward in that game because of the personnel that they had. But I thought the guys that were in there, everybody looked like they belonged, no doubt about that. And it was, for Casey Fitzgerald, first father-son duo to play playoff games for the Florida Panthers. So that was a really cool little milestone for them, with his dad obviously being Tom, who's an original Panther, and cool to see Casey get to suit up there for Game 4.
Yeah, unfortunately, Tom Fitzgerald is currently busy being GM of the New Jersey Devils. Of course, last time I checked that score, New Jersey was winning 1-0. Jack Hughes scored for the New Jersey Devils for their first goal. I haven't rechecked the score on that one, but also with there was a change as well with the power play as well, with Aaron Ekblad being out. And spoke about it with another friend of ours yesterday on the show, Alex Dono of 560. So we spoke about how the power play, the different look that you put with Bennett as well versus Aaron Ekblad being out on the point and then going back to that left circle to shoot. So it's a different look for that power play for the Florida Panthers as well. But also, speaking of injuries, the Florida Panthers the Boston Bruins are likely bringing in Patrice Bergeron. At least that's the hope for them for Game 5. That was the last update we heard, that he was possibly going to play Game 5. And you were talking about pre-recording of a player being sent down back to Providence, who's in the Atlantic Division, same division as the Charlotte Checkers, had a bye in the first round, so had a little bit of time to rest for the Providence Bruins. So doesn't make it an any easier task if in fact Patrice Bergeron does suit up for the Boston Bruins on Wednesday night, Doug.
Yeah, nothing definitive there, but just reading between the lines, the reports were suggesting that he's going to be a regular participant in practice coming up tomorrow. Obviously, we're doing this on Monday night, so on Tuesday that he would be a regular participant in practice. And there was a forward, Oscar Steen, getting sent down to the American League. So you read between the lines there. Obviously, they have multiple scratches on the Boston side, so they have other depth. And you wonder, just guessing. When Krejci came out, it was Jakub Lauko, the forward, who came into the Boston lineup. So you'd think that if Bergeron were to draw back into the lineup, obviously the lines would look different, but you think maybe Lauko would be the guy that would come out because he wasn't in there for the first couple of games of the series for Boston, although in very brief time on the ice, limited role. He has another guy on their side who has kept up and hasn't looked out of place, when he's been out there for the Boston Bruins. But Patrice Bergeron has meant so much to that team. And there was in the media availability the other day that Jim Montgomery did. This would have been on Saturday, which wasn't a game day, but he was talking about the involvement that Bergeron's had and how he's when he's not been in the lineup, he's almost acted. He's still maintained his leadership role. It almost sounds like he's taken on somewhat of a coaching position with them in the time that he's been out, because, and what Jim Montgomery said, he's able to do that. Not all superstar players turn out to be great coaches, obviously, but with Patrice Bergeron, Jim Montgomery pointed to the fact that because he's a great face-off guy, he can speak the language of a fourth-line center or a penalty killer, because he is a guy that is a great offensive player too. He can speak the language of the power play guys. He can talk to the top line guys. He can talk about playing a defensive role or an offensive role because he's so versatile. And I said in our post-game show the other day with Billy Lindsay, I said, it shows you how good Patrice Bergeron is, that he hasn't played in this series, and we're still sitting here talking about him. So it just illustrates what he means to that Boston team. But that's one thing the Panthers will have to deal with, not just Patrice Bergeron, but I can tell you, if he does suit up for Game 5, there's going to be quite a roar when number 37, wearing the C on his jersey, comes out of the tunnel for warm-ups. If that happens, there's no doubt that it's going to bring some juice into the building, if you will, for Game 5. So that's something else to monitor, not just the skill level that and the attributes that Bergeron possesses, but just the emotional lift that he could bring if he's back out there. So that's something the Panthers will certainly have to deal with, because if he's out there, you think that he's healthy enough to play, and if he's healthy enough to play, even if he's not 100%. He's a tough matchup, and he can still play a key role defensively for them as well. So, again, something to monitor. But it's the Stanley Cup playoffs again. If I can imagine, not knowing Patrice Bergeron, I'm sure, like any great competitor, he can't stand having to watch the games. He probably can't wait to get back out there. So we'll see what happens come Game 5.
Yeah, no doubt. So. And this gives us an opportunity to talk more about Game 5 and something to think about with before we transition over to segment number 3, Doug. And just think about this before I read our ad. And it's 3 words: home ice disadvantage with a question mark. So we'll talk about that next in the third and final segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But first, we're going to tell you all about Game Time. And buying your tickets to your favorite event shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets for all sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of event. And if the Florida Panthers happen to force a Game 6, you could even go buy your last-minute tickets on the Game Time app. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, hockey, theater, and more. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets. Lowest price. Guaranteed. Third and final segment here on this Tuesday, April 25th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. It's a series check-in edition of the show with the radio play-by-play voice of the Florida Panthers, Doug Plagens. And I first want to ask you, Doug, How cool was it for you to see your broadcast partner Billy Lindsay banging the drum before Game 3?
That was awesome, and I joked with him. I said, I don't think that we might need to check on the drum. I don't think it's ever been hit that hard. So he was letting that thing have it, and I thought it was awesome. It was great to see the response too, and just see what he means to the organization and so many of the fans. And I've had the privilege to meet so many of them, but so many of the fans that have been around since the early days of the franchise or from day one. What Billy and his teammates from those early teams meant to a lot of the sports fans and the hockey fans in this region. And still to this day, it's just really cool to be able to see Billy go out there. And I can tell you, he was so excited to do it. And I know that like all the players, like the coaches, like all of us, like the fans, there's nothing more that he'd rather see than to see the Panthers win a Stanley Cup at some point in time. So I can tell you when that moment does happen, Billy's probably going to be running out onto the ice to get that to carry it around at some point in time. So again, it was just really, really exciting, really cool to see him bang that drum and get everybody fired up.
Yeah, and it's just that emotional connection you have with the franchise, and of course, still being involved with his role in the broadcast. And I did see a Ray Bourque jersey at FLA Live Arena in game 4, and it's the first thing I thought about when it came to, and when I saw that was Bill Lindsay. So going back to the question I asked you for you to think about prior to reading my ad and transitioning to this segment. Home ice disadvantage with a question mark at the end. This weekend, the road teams were 8-0 on Saturday and Sunday, and of course, we already saw a win for the Florida Panthers in Game 2. Of course, in order to win this series, you're going to have to win in Boston twice. Of course, backs against the wall. And how do you feel about the Panthers and their confidence level going into Boston when they know they've won there before, and knowing that with the NHL, it's not like any other. It's not like no other league is like the NHL when it comes to home ice advantage, where road teams win more often than in other sports.
Yeah, going off both the things you said. First of all, this has always been a confident team, and especially in the second half, this has been a really confident group. Even before the 6-game win streak that ultimately helped them get into the playoffs, they had that 4-game losing streak. And even in and around that, the belief never wavered from this team. So they've maintained a high level of confidence, and especially knowing that they've gotten the result they wanted. They've seen what the blueprint to win a game in Boston looks like back in Game 2. I think that can go a long way. And this is the team that's going to be confident going on the road, no doubt about it. But I think that's the other thing you look at in the National Hockey League. Unlike any of the other sports, in the NHL, it almost seems like the league is designed nowadays for teams to come back. You're never out of a game. You saw that Oilers-Kings game the other night.
Yeah. 3-0.
The Kings were up 3-0, and Edmonton came back and won the game in overtime. And years ago, the 1990s New Jersey Devils, if they got a 2-1 lead, they were just going to clamp it down, and you were never going to get through the neutral zone. And there have been rule tweaks over the years that have been made to increase speed and increase offense and things like that. And I think because of a lot of that, teams are never out of games. And the skill level is also so high. Even the teams at the bottom of the standings have a line or two of guys that can really burn you if you're not careful. So I think the league in some ways is designed for teams to never be out of games. And I think we've seen that, over these last few years, especially. As far as the home ice is concerned, I think during the season, you're running into teams on back-to-backs, or teams are on road trips. You might be in the second game of your homestand playing a team that's playing its fourth game in 6 nights on the road at the end of a trip. You know, the schedules are, everybody's schedule is going to be in different stages over the course of a season. When you get to the playoffs, every team is on the same calendar. You play for this series. The Panthers play 2 games in Boston, and then the 2 teams come to Florida and they play 2 games here, and then they go back to Boston to play a game and so forth. So everybody's on the same schedule. Everybody's able to set their practice schedules about the same. So, and everybody's traveling the same distances. So you're on the same wavelength there. The other thing is during the season, I think that the home teams do have a big advantage during the regular season, especially when it's the playoff type teams, the playoff contending teams against the non-playoff type teams, because that last change really matters. The deeper, if a home team is deeper than the road team, if the home team is a team that's in that group, say the 16 teams that made the Stanley Cup playoffs, they're probably deeper than the non-playoff teams. And if those playoff teams are playing on home ice and they have the ability to make the last change and get the matchup that they want, they're probably going to be able to expose the weaknesses of an opponent that's not as deep, that isn't able to get the matchups that it wants on every shift. In the playoffs, all these teams have depth. Every team in the Stanley Cup playoffs is good. I bring this up on our podcast, Territory Talk, a lot, but there was a time, before the 90s expansion, before the Sharks and then the Panthers and, the Ducks and the Lightning and the Senators, before that wave of expansion happened, there was a time in the 80s, 16 out of 21 teams were making the Stanley Cup playoffs. Mm-hmm. So your top seeds were feasting on those bottom teams. Nowadays, 16 out of 32 get in. You can't back into the Stanley Cup playoffs anymore. You've got to be playing well to get in the playoffs. And there are every year 2, 3, 4 teams that miss the playoffs that, had they got in and gotten the right matchup, would have been capable of winning a round or 2. So every team that gets in the Stanley Cup playoffs is good. Every team in the playoffs has depth and elite talent. Every team that gets in the playoffs has depth at every position. That's why I think the playing field just evens out. And unlike any other sport, the talent gap between a number 1 seed and a number 8 seed in the National Hockey League, it is much less than it is in the other sports. Hockey truly is the just get in sport, because when everything evens out and the schedules are the same for the 2 teams playing, it becomes every series can become very competitive. So that's my long and drawn out explanation, I think, as to why we see more comebacks in hockey and why we see, maybe especially once you get to the playoffs, road teams maybe having more success in the Stanley Cup playoffs than any of the other leagues' playoffs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it just takes winning one at a time on Wednesday night and get at least getting it back to your home ice on Friday night to give yourself a chance. All you need is to give yourself a chance for a comeback, and you just have to focus on that one game. Before we sign off here, Wednesday's game will be a little bit of a conflict with the South Florida sports scene. So I want you to
playing too, right?
And the Marlins. So if you have any programming notes for Wednesday's game against the Boston Bruins, are you able to announce to the crowd of the listeners where the game will be on Wednesday?
Yep, absolutely. So good. Thanks for pointing that out. So on Wednesday for Game 5, if you're looking for where we are on the Panthers radio network, we will be, if you're listening in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, we will not be on 560 WQAM on Wednesday. We will be on AM 790. So you'll be able to find us on AM 790, Radio Libre 790. And hey, the Panthers won Game 2, and we were on 790 that night. So hey, we're looking for some positive mojo. Maybe there's some positive vibes right there. So will be on 790 on your AM dial if you're listening in Miami-Dade and Broward counties on Wednesday. But as I always tell everybody, if you're looking to take the guesswork out of it, the NHL app takes you right to it. Go to your when you go to the scoreboard, you click that little headphone icon in the top right corner, and you select our feed, of course, and off you go. So again, if you ever have a hard time finding us, just go right to the NHL app, and that'll take all the guesswork out of it. But if you're in your car driving around during the game, if you got something you got to go to on a Wednesday night that's going to prevent you from being able to be in one location, and you want to flip the game on, AM 790 is where you can find us for the action coming up on Wednesday for Game 5.
Yeah, and also channel 932 on Sirius XM. That's the Panthers feed as well.
Yep.
And
a lot of
also
people don't know that. If you're a Sirius XM subscriber and you have the app, channel 932 is always the Panthers game, and it's always our broadcast. So I know I listen a lot to I believe it's channel 810, I think, during football season where I find the Lions games. I think they're on that. I think I have it on my favorites too, the Tigers channel. So it's on your Sirius XM app if you have it. You might not even know you have it, but if you have Sirius XM, you can get the app. And if you have the app, you can get channel 932, and that's always the Panthers broadcast.
And of course, the Odyssey is another app which is partnered with the Locked On Podcast Network.
The
so you
free
can also
Odyssey app, the free Odyssey app. Yes, get it totally free, and you can listen to every Panthers game on there as well.
Yep. So that is your programming for Game 5 on Wednesday night for the Panthers and the Bruins. So you could follow Doug Plagens at Doug Plagens. You could also follow the Territory Talk podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and where Doug Plagens also has his 5-minute morning skates before each and every Florida Panthers game. So, Doug, thank you so much, and hopefully I will see you in the off season.
Hopefully we see you for an even deeper playoff run here. So we'll definitely be in touch. But always love coming on the show. Thanks for having me, and best of luck. We'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Steel Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And make sure to come back for Wednesday's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. It is a Winans Wednesday edition of the show. We'll be officially previewing the Florida Panthers versus the Boston Bruins on Wednesday night. So I'm Armando Velez with Doug Plagens, and you've been listening to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.